Welcome to Inaudible. I'm your host, Jeremy Weiland, and I'm joined by my co-host, Nithin Reddy. On this podcast, we discuss the weird, beautiful channeled messages found in the long tradition of contact with the Confederation of Planets in service to the one infinite creator. These messages articulate a philosophy of spiritual evolution, popularly known as the Law of One. Many of these messages are available to listen to on our sister podcast, Living Love and Light, available on all platforms. We seek to provide analysis and commentary on this philosophy described in these messages, identifying the common themes and grappling with the application of this information to our human lives. However, we are not counselors, gurus, or experts of any kind, so please evaluate our words in light of our shortcomings and use your own best judgment. Thanks for listening. Hey, Nithin, how's it going?
Wonderful. How are you, man?
I'm doing great. I recorded the last episode that the listener listened to on Purity earlier today, and I am chomping at the bit to jump into this thing that we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, so am
I already went over all my life issues that are going on in my life. So what's going on with you?
I guess, same old. I guess you'd have heard, I think, that I'm probably going to be moving shortly, but hopefully at least. So there's always that. It's kind of interesting. It's always that new energy with a new place, right? So
right.
Just, not moving very far, but it's always nice to step into a new place. But other than that, life's good. How about, so have you had a lot on your plate?
Well, the whole starting a new job on Monday, and then getting in a 4-car pileup.
Oh yeah, congratulations on the job.
Yeah, thanks. The catalyst will continue, I'm sure, but I'm really looking forward to a qualitatively different role than I've had for the last 20 plus years. So whether it's worse or better, it will be different.
Yeah, sounds exciting. I'm happy for you.
Cool. Well, you were the one who suggested this topic for today. Do you want to give a little bit of an intro on what we're talking about?
Yeah, I just thought in terms of a good way to approach this. So, the topic for today is kind of orange and yellow ray interactions with others. And it's a big topic. There's a lot to discuss. I don't know if we'll necessarily cover all aspects today, but in terms of kind of the overview, I was thinking we could first kind of go over the definitions of what we're talking about when we're talking about orange and yellow ray centers, and then go into common challenges that seekers often face with orange and yellow ray interaction with others. And then kind of go into orange and yellow ray distortions or frameworks for orange and yellow ray distortions that I find are very useful in kind of thinking about the situations. Then we'll talk about the infamous mirroring effect that dealing with others always seems to have. And then kind of tie it back together in how these lower rays, orange and yellow and even red, kind of springboard into green and beyond. So with that, why don't we just get right into it in terms of, what do we mean when we're talking about orange and yellow ray centers, specifically with reference to interaction with others? Jeremy, what are your thoughts on that?
I think what we're talking about with orange and yellow ray are, these are two centers that come directly after the first one, which is that foundational, life-giving, survival, like the basic energy center that you would need to simply be a homeostatic entity, consuming energy and producing things. When we get to orange ray, we're starting to get that first level of refinement. And it has to do with, as I understand it, your relationships with, however, one other person, not just everybody in general, but your relationship with one other person. Now, this can be another person than you, another entity, but it can also be your relationship with yourself. What we're talking about is this relationship in this single dimension, right? Where it's this one-to-one relating, whether it's one-to-one relating with yourself or with others. It's this intensive, nuanced, particular relationship. As we move on to yellow ray, we are talking about something that approaches more of society in general, right? Like what are your duties to the culture in which you live? What are your duties as the role that you're playing in this life? if you are a provider of your family, that has certain duties that are not just about your specific emotional relationship with each child or your wife or your partner, but this is about a more general kind of role that you play in the social energy complex, we could say.
Yeah.
And yeah, it can partake of legal concepts, employment concepts, political concepts. Even I think politics relates a lot to this this yellow ray dimension of intercourse with others, where you're not relating in this very, very personal way, this personal and like intimate way. That's what I think the big thing is. It's like it's a level of intimacy. With the orange ray, it's a little bit more intimate of a relationship that we're talking about, because it partakes of two uh, uh, people, even if that's you to yourself. That's still a spectrum of that's bookended by two entities. In yellow ray, we're talking about something that is generalized to a wide number of people, and the way that you conceive of your identity in that network of relationships. Does that tack to what you were thinking, Nithin?
Yeah, absolutely. I would just have two refinements in that. Well, three. As mentioned before, orange and yellow ray are a little bit broader than just interaction with other selves or selves in general. But we're kind of focused more on just interaction with selves. So, obviously, like orange ray deals with like the your relationship to your emotions and things of that nature, power, personal power. But we're not kind of covering that today, except as they relate to interactions with others.
Right.
Absolutely. I viewed orange ray as the relationship with an individual self, including yourself, and yellow ray as kind of your relationships with groups of individuals and on a non-personal basis, generally speaking. There's raw quotes about kind of, it's almost like it's a smooth continuum between orange and yellow in their interactions. And the only other thing I would add, and maybe we disagree a little bit, and I originally was more along the lines of your thinking, in that yellow ray is very much duties and roles and responsibilities, and often it can be in terms of how you interact with groups. But there's an interesting raw quote in talking about orange ray distortion, in that just an individual relationship with another self of master slave is an orange ray relationship, orange ray distortion. They talk about ray of possession and things like that. So at least for some versions of orange ray interaction, you can treat an individual purely as a duty-based relationship, which I would say is not ideal, but it can occur on an individual basis.
Yeah, I think we might have some difference there, and it's just good to acknowledge it. See, when you brought up the master servant relationship as an orange ray relationship, like every relationship to me partakes of all the rays in some way, right? The question is, which predominates for the purpose of understanding this frequency of the energy at work, right?
Right.
For example, in a master servant relationship, the yellow ray aspect of it is in those formal duties that one takes on to play the role. The thing that's so genius about your example, and I really appreciate you bringing up, is that it's not just that involves that relationship. There is also a more intimate side of it. Nietzsche talked about this, I believe, that the servant it grows in that relationship because they have to do all the work. And so they know all the things that go into making the master, whereas the master is weakened because they come to depend upon the servant. Hey, just a quick note. I made a mistake. That is actually Hegel. The master slave dialectic is something that's talked about in the phenomenology of spirit, and that is not something that I'm an expert on. I clearly heard that secondhand. I still want to read that book really bad, but I haven't. It's not Nietzsche, though. I got that completely wrong. He had an idea in one of his books about master morality and slave morality that's completely different, a lot more negative, and so I want to be clear that we need to make a distinction there. Anyway, back to the program. That has a yellow ray connotation to it. It also has this orange ray connotation, in the sense that the servant needs to kind of anticipate the master's needs. It needs to kind of be able to the servant needs to put him or herself in the master's shoes in order to understand and anticipate what the master wants. The master can kind of like be thoughtless in how they think about their own needs, except to the extent that they kind of like whine and complain and ask for them. So there's all of these dynamics. And then, of course, I think there's also a green ray aspect too, right? It might be very small,
Absolutely.
but there's still this like selfless giving that sometimes occurs in any relationship, no matter how negative. And then we can go into blue ray and all this stuff. And remember, I would just point out that when we're talking about examples of these rays and how they sort of manifest, they are exemplified just as much by when they are brought into existence in full flower and in full spectrum color as they are when they are abnegated and diminished in color. Like, I think the very fact that I can go to the store and have an interaction with a cashier that is almost entirely yellow ray brings out the fact that we don't have that orange ray relationship that's very strong. It's there, but it's not very strong. It's not predominating in our consciousness.
Right. I love your example of interacting with a cashier. So the way I would kind of define how orange ray interactions when they're role based is different than yellow ray interactions when they're role based is it's almost like, are you interacting based on a group identity or a classification? Like, I'm interacting with the sales clerk. There's there's culturally accepted ways of doing that. You go up to pay. That they're a cashier. So you might just initially ask them, maybe you're not even there to pay. You just ask them a question about the store because you expect them as a clerk, they would know that. Right. So it's kind of like your yellow ray interaction based on duties is you don't know anything about them, but purely on the basis of their role that you perceive their role to be, or something about their group characteristic. You're going to be attributing certain things to them, and it's going to affect your interaction. Now, there's harmless examples of that, right? Or let me word it better. There's examples that don't necessarily are not necessarily negatively oriented. Like, assuming that a sales clerk would know certain things about the store is not, I don't think, inherently negative. But for example, if we go into the areas of racism where you're automatically assuming certain attributes based on the color of their skin, that is a very negative, like hierarchical way of looking at the world, right? Service to self, because you're basically putting people below or beneath you based on group characteristics. But with respect to, I think there is and it is complicated, but I think in general there's much overlap between orange and yellow ray interaction when you're talking about roles. But the orange ray kind of interaction with a role is kind of well, let me read this quote from Ra, and then we'll get into how I understand this. So 32.2, session 32, question 2, questioner. Thank you very much. I will now continue with the material from the day before yesterday. Our subject is how sexual polarity acts as a catalyst in evolution and how best to make use of this catalyst. Going back to the material, I will fill in the gaps that we will possibly don't understand at this point too well. Can you tell me the difference between orange and yellow ray activation? I'm going to work up from red ray on through the violet. Basically, in Ra answers, I am Ra. The orange ray is the influence or vibratory pattern wherein the mind, body, spirit expresses its power on an individual basis. Thus, power over individuals may be seen to be orange ray. This ray has been quite intense amongst your peoples on an individual basis. You may see this ray in treating of other cells as non-entities, slaves, chattel, thus giving other selves no status whatever. And then it goes on to say the yellow ray is a focal and very powerful ray. So the reason I think Ra talks about that is I would say certainly race-based slavery is a very much yellow thing, very much, right? But if you look back in Roman times and Bronze Age times, they had non-race-based slavery. Like, you lost in a war. I took you prisoner. I captured you. Or not even a war. Slave traders, right? From what I read in the history books, I've never personally observed this, but slave traders, they might find a traveler by themselves and just capture them, right? And by virtue of I have exerted my power over you, you are now a slave. It has nothing to do with your group characteristics. It is 100% due to our individual interaction and that I conquered you physically. And it is complicated. but I think there is an orange ray kind of interaction, a very distorted orange ray interaction, where you can purely see them as a particular role or relationship that is a little bit distinct from the yellow ray role or relationship interaction you have.
I think you clarified it immensely, Nithin. And I appreciate you quoting a raw chapter and verse like that, because in this case, I think it was very helpful. Expressing power as an individual is very, very close to how I was thinking of it, but that really focused in on what I think is important. And it's also important to understand that, like, in all of these situations, it can start out as predominantly orange ray and turn into yellow ray, or start out, for example, in the case of slavery by conquest, for example. A yellow ray organization of martial power into an army conquering, right? It's a big machine. They're all interacting together based on their duties and roles,
right.
Almost anonymously, right? Who they are as a personality, as a unique individual, is not what's primary in that ray. What's primary in that ray is your position within the energy complex, right? So you think of an army, they conquer all these people, they take slaves, and then you take on one of the slaves as a soldier in that army. And now it has become an issue where the yellow ray relation has sort of like deepened into an orange ray relationship, where now it is your personal relationship with this person. And of course, mastery is a very individual thing, because unless you are now maybe that would be different in a Roman time when you have an individual slave that you're controlling and dominating. That would be different than on, say, like a plantation in the 1700s in America, where your ability to work with that slave goes through an overseer or like a bureaucracy that isolates you from the actual exercise of the power.
Right.
I'm sorry that we're using such a negative thing to talk about these rays, but it puts it in very fine focus, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think maybe this is a useful time to go into a segue of really to understand a lot of the orange and yellow ray interactions with others. Honestly, when I thought about this session, I thought we're going to, and I hope we will, focus a lot on just like seemingly harmless social interactions and social groups and friend groups. But so much for the orange and yellow ray is related to power, right? So I think it might be a good idea. Let me just dive into this topic of power as I understand it in my present journey. It's always evolving, right? In
Go
orange
off,
and yellow ray. So let me say this. I feel that a lot of people misunderstand the nature of power. So I think a lot of people automatically assume that having some sort of power hierarchy or hierarchy in general is inherently negative. And I having been in a bunch of different, business contexts where, we've tried the 50-50 partnership versus, having a person who would be loosely defined as a CEO and having maybe the rest of the executive team be CFO and things of that nature. And what came abundantly clear to me is that, look, 50-50 partnerships in businesses can work, but you can empower the entire group, all members of the group, sometimes, not always, but sometimes, by having someone who has a little bit more decision-making power, right? Like the CEO versus the CFO. Now, it doesn't mean that the CEO is inherently superior, has more rights, is just better than the CFO. In fact, the CFO's role could be more important, could actually wield more power in an individual situation involving finances, involving audits. But simply having a clear decision-making hierarchy, some sort of power structure, can actually empower the entire organization. And I think often people are like, well, unless it's 50-50 in whatever situation, I'm less of a person, right? I don't view myself as less of a person just because I have a boss at work, okay? Like he doesn't have inherently more rights or power over me, except in a very limited sense. The way I see it is that I choose to be a part of this organization because I understand that a very effective way to work, at least where we are right now in transitioning third and fourth density, is sometimes having some sort of loose power structure. Now, obviously, if you have a crazy boss or you have a horrible CEO who's going to ignore their executive team and all their direct reports, that's not good either. But I think people often misunderstand that just because there's some sort of hierarchical power relationship, that it's inherently negative or inherently unequal. And I at least I personally don't view it that way. I actually
Yeah.
view it as a good hierarchy is empowering to all members of the hierarchy.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is something that, as you can imagine, with my political affinities, I've thought about quite a bit. I do agree with you, and I think it's a very important point. I want to try and see if I can take a slightly different take on what you said.
Please.
A lot of what is sort of encompassed in these rays as pure expressions of the Creator's love and light and energy are different, like different ways of channeling identity. If you're like in orange ray, you're channeling identity as an individual relating to another individual. And if you're channeling yellow ray, if that's predominating in your mind, in your expression, then you're thinking of yourself as the group in a way. Like your interests, your ability to think in terms of how to relate to things happens as the group being the recipient of the benefit and incurring the cost, right? So you're thinking in more of this, I am part of the group. And that's informing how you as an individual relate to things. But you're like, the idea that I'm trying to point out here is that identity is very arbitrary. I've always said this in a unified creation. The idea that we are one part of it is a complete fabrication from the get-go, right? So the idea is that the 7 rays allow you 7 different ways of being a self. 7 different ways of conceiving of your agency, your identity, your role in things. And I think it's just important to understand that hierarchy in particular is something that I'm very uncomfortable with, but only because of the way that we realize hierarchy. Those of Ra say the entire creation is hierarchically structured. But in the creation, there is no there's no political power per se, right? Like when things happen in the natural world from the point of view of physics, forces interact, things collide, and consequences ensue as a consequence of these basic laws. And it is only in human relations that we start to have this idea of intention and the ability to manipulate other people intentionally and expressly at using them rather than relating to them as equals. Hierarchy can happen and predominate in situations where people relate to each other as equals. The problem is that it doesn't mean that your position on the hierarchy is fixed.
Right.
You might, in a certain situation, be the most powerful. You might be at the top of the pyramid. But in another situation, someone else might be better off at the top of the pyramid. And I believe, this is speculation on my part, but I believe that the service to others hierarchy is one that can reconfigure itself based on the needs of the whole. The service to self hierarchy, did I say service to others earlier or service to self?
I think you said it right.
Service to others. Okay.
Yeah,
service to self. Right. Okay, good. Service to self hierarchy is one in which the whole motivation is to keep the highest position on the hierarchy possible in spite of what might be best for everyone, right? Because it's best for yourself. And it's right. Your ability to maintain a cohesive identity and agency comes from your ability to marshal and retain as much power as possible. And I would like to, just to wrap this up, talk about what it means when we say power. In politics, there's a pretty formal definition that says that power is the ability to reliably affect changes in the world, right? If I can, there are tons of people who could blunder in a situation where their actions would have, 1 million times more consequences than they realize and could affect everything. Like there's countless situations in history where people, in spite of themselves, affect things. But that's not power because they didn't make it. They didn't say, I want to do this. And then they were able to take that idea of what they wanted to do, that intention, and actually manifest it. Power is when you're able to have that idea in your head and you can actually make it happen through some sort of force you're able to exert, whether that's charisma, the instrumentality of the bureaucracy that you're in charge of, whatever. It could just be you're like, like a priest who's very famous, is just able through their own charisma to make things happen, and they're able to reliably do that. And what that power is very intangible, and that's what makes it so mysterious and coveted, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think that was a good kind of a segue into the next topic on this broad spectrum here is what are some common challenges that we face, maybe personal examples in orange and yellow ray interaction with others. And I guess let me just start off. So one thing I always find difficult as a self-avowed introvert is sometimes it's very difficult, especially early in my life when I maybe didn't have as much experience in these situations in social interactions as other people, is understanding what another self is thinking or what they want, right? Because it's not just the veil. Our interactions with each other, at least for me, and so here in SoCal, they're often very veiled, right? People are not it's very straightforward in what they truly want or how they feel, and you kind of have to figure it out from maybe things other than what they purely say, right? So I think the first thing for me that can be a challenge and has been a challenge maybe in the past, although obviously I'd like to think now I'm very good at it, given that, I'm in court doing jury trials and things of that nature. But is really what are other people thinking and feeling about the situation truly? Whether it's about you, whether it's about some issue that is presented to, to both of you or to the group, like what do they truly feel about it, right?
Yeah, and there's a polarity concern in there as well. Do I want to know what other people truly think and feel so that I can position myself against them best and get the most benefit from the relationship, from the situation that obtains? Or do I want to know what they're really thinking and feeling and desiring so that I can serve them? And like the funny thing about the service to others path is that serving them doesn't necessarily mean pleasing them, which introduces an even broader problem into what it is that we should actually do. I think it's a huge issue. And one thing we might consider is that doing the right thing may not be the most important concern.
Please.
In other words, we can't know. We can't know what the right thing is.
Right.
So we can tie ourselves in knots, or we can try to formalize or reify the situation which we find ourselves, and try to make it into a kind of game theory sort of situation, right? But I think what that approach has as problematic is that it draws upon our desire for control.
Right.
Power is the ability to affect your will on the world, but that's a kind of control if you need everything to be exactly right for you to be able to do that. A more service to others way of doing it would be to give your best and to know yourself well enough to be able to give what you can recognize as your best, and then to ask for forgiveness and to accept it wholeheartedly when someone pushes back on you. In other words, like to accept that, hey, I'm dealing with an imperfect situation. I don't know what this person wants. I can ask them, but they may not be able to express it, whether they are unwilling to tell me. They don't know it themselves, right? Like often when you have examples of service and confederation channeling, you are talking about giving something to somebody that they don't even know that they want yet.
Right.
And you're tapping into an intuitive read of the situation. The more that you can get your we talked about this last episode with purity, the more you can get out of your own way and let your light shine through, you might find yourself thinking, saying, doing things that you didn't anticipate, but that are coming from this vibration that you feel. Now, this is an exercise within faith that is rather advanced, I think. And yet I think people do it all the time. They do it without even thinking about it because they're coming from this place of love. Similarly, people can often manipulate other people without even thinking about it, thinking that they might even think they're coming from a place of love. And yet that fear that something might happen if they don't seize control and make it concrete, and their ability to realize what they want for the other person is imperiled if they don't take control. Like this is what makes polarity so subtle. And what I think we can do in this exploration of the orange and yellow ray in particular is try to tease out these polarized aspects of realizing these rays, not just so we can understand the rays better, but we can understand polarity better, right?
Absolutely. And this can't be understated, that the fact that forcing your version or your will upon others when you think it's for their best is at least between two adults, or at least between two people who are, able to make decisions, is definitely a very controlling and can be a very negative thing. You see it in a lot of families, right, with their children.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, to a certain extent, it's a little bit more blurry when the children are very young, but when they're 18, they're not really children anymore. It's very important to that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think even the parent-child relationship needs to be understood as inherently, to the extent it's controlling, it does partake of some kind of negativity. Like, I think it needs to be accepted that we are not going to be purely positive. If you were to, I do think that there's a role there's a role for the idea that a child is not fully self-realized, and therefore their desires and their will and their intention may not represent their true desire, their true will, their true intention. They don't know how to orient themselves within the society, orient themselves within the duties and the roles that they find themselves within. And therefore, they need a guiding hand, and it won't always be a guiding hand that is giving them the feedback that they desire. It will sometimes be feedback that they do not think that they desire. But to me, this just goes to show that we need both the negative and positive poles. The positive polarity does not abnegate the value of the negative pole. In fact, in a lot of Kuo sessions, they talk about how it is from the negative, the service to self path, that we have that's where all our power is, our grit, our ability to persevere. If you think of, I was talking about this in the other podcast, but you think about what it takes to actually persevere on the negative path through all the densities, how much raw will and ability to focus your intention it takes, in spite of all of the setbacks, you're literally militating against the very nature of reality, and you're still accomplishing it. That
Right.
is incredible grit and focus and determination. And if you can make that your friend, an equal partner in the complex of things that comprise yourself, then you have that available to you, and you can balance it with all the other stuff that's going on. We on the positive path recognize the validity of the negative path. We just don't choose to emphasize that.
Yeah. So just 2 points. I would say that at least with raising children, I wouldn't necessarily view it as control, although certainly you can be very controlling, because often children, by the nature of their impulsiveness, what they want in the moment isn't necessarily what they truly want. Right. And then the second thing is that I would word it differently, in that the negative path is made up by certain energy configurations, right? And some of those energy configurations are pure distortions that have no place in the positive path. So, for example, treating other, this is going into philosophy, it's been forever, but treating other selves as means, right? That's a purely negative distortion that is very effective for polarizing along the negative path. But the negative path, does focus on some things that are not necessarily distortions, but are more useful for the negative path. So, for example, both the positive and the negative path can benefit from building up just a pure, what do you call it? A pure primal sense of personal power, right? It's how you use it that makes it positive or negative. But obviously, if you're all about power and you don't care about the heart, you're probably going to focus more on that orange ray, just building of personal power. But if a positive entity chose to build personal power, it's not necessarily negative. It's how you use it. So I see that the negative path has distortions that are purely negative, but then they have configurations that are consistent with the positive. It's just that they're valued more in the negative role, right? Willpower is probably valued more, but willpower isn't necessarily positive or negative. It's more how you use it. So that's how I would kind of word it, in that there are things that the negative path focuses on that are also things that are consistent and useful for the positive path. We just don't focus on it as much, right?
Yeah, and I appreciate everything you're saying. For me, I think it's really important for a discussion of polarity not to deviate into putting aspects of humanity in good and bad buckets, right?
Right.
Like, the idea should be that all of this is very fluid. How we intend things, how we use our power, like, we don't even understand how we do this a lot of the time. So for me, I really want to always have this like kind of mix of these polarities at hand in any situation. So we always have front of mind that idea that it's our choice and that the choice is presented to us at every moment, instead of saying, well, parenting might seem like control, but it's actually good. No. Parenting is control, and control can definitely be a bad thing. And I don't think there's any parent who hasn't abused their power of control at some point. I also don't think there's any parent that has never shown any kind of concern or love for their child if they actually have a relationship with them. It's inherent in the nature of having a relationship with someone that they matter, at least in some sense. So like, all of these things are it's really where we, as creative agents of the creator, as individual, like, chips off the old block, where do we place the emphasis? That, I think, is where polarity comes in. And I think it is in the yellow and orange rays that you are going to see the most examples of this mix coming into play. And your ability to emphasize the positive over the negative, your ability to take a situation that would normally call for rigid control and find a creative way to make it a way of setting the person free. I think there's a lot of things that come off as controlling in parenting that actually is about freeing the person, but it's not freeing the person in this moment right now. It's a broader, longer view of who that person is. And that's love, to see somebody as not just who you are right now, but in the broad scheme of things.
Right. So I think, the disagreement for us might be more theoretical than practical, because in practice, I've always been big on, you might recognize a goal, but it's not about reminding yourself, I have to be this way. It's about how to organically get there.
Yes.
I'm not a parent. If I was a parent, I am 100% sure there's going to be some not very controlling, there's going to be some controlling things. And I don't think forcing myself to say, oh, don't exercise control is going to be helpful. Nope. I think in practice on this earth, on this planet, just the way where we are in society and what we've been taught and raised, no matter how much we try, it's going to be somewhat negative in certain ways.
Yes.
I do, though, believe that there is, like, as we're transitioning closer and closer to fourth density, there is a way to parent more and more where we get rid of these 3D mechanisms. But frankly, I think right now, if I decide to sit down, have a child, and be like, I'm going to parent from a fourth density perspective, I think it would be a total disaster, because frankly, I don't think you can get there by just reminding yourself. You have to get there organically, and getting there organically is often trying to do your best, doing what currently kind of works, and learning from it. And part of that is going to be using some, more controlling aspects of parenting. But I think actually this entire topic of the difficulty in understanding what someone else is thinking kind of segues to the next common challenge I think that I face, and I think a lot of seekers face, is, so you don't know what they're thinking, right? I think we've mainly discussed issues where we don't have much skin in the game, but there's so many situations where we have skin in the game. There might be an interaction where we don't know what's really going on, what they're truly thinking, but it's on a subject that there's personal strong resonance for us, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, and this can happen on an orange or yellow ray interaction. There's an ambiguous situation. You just had a story, and then you get this really sarcastic laugh at the end of it in a group, and you're like, okay. And let's say you are a person who's already maybe self-conscious about that story for whatever reason. then it's this comes up all the time, right? Is it me or is it them, right? Or is it something totally unrelated? Maybe sometimes in those rare situations, something else happened across the room, across the bar that they're laughing at, right? And it's almost like it's a very free will um, choice there of how you're going to interpret that, right? And a
Yeah.
lot of times there's a lot of polarity in that interpretation, right?
I think it's in the interpretation. I think even Ross says this. It's in the interpretation of events, the interpretation of catalysts in particular, that the positive and negative paths are called out most realistically and in the moment, in the context, right? Like, what's your spontaneous reaction to that catalyst? Is your spontaneous reaction to that laughter being like, oh, they must be making fun of me? Or is your spontaneous reaction like, oh, something's funny, I wonder what it is, maybe it's me? Like
Right, right.
this freeness and this willingness to accept the situation's ambiguity, rather than this rush to have it be in this certain interpretation, this certain context, I think has a lot to do with the difference between the paths.
And it's really the mirroring effect that occurs when you're interacting with other selves, and it's so hard, right? Because especially if you have a lot of, I mean, we all have stuff from our past where we're still kind of working on it, or it's still kind of in the back of our mind, and sometimes it's not even conscious, right? And it just it warps our interpretation of the situation. I I definitely have examples of that. Do you have any examples where that's happened to you?
Like where my interpretation of things was warped from what was actually going on?
Based on strong experiences you've had in the past, yes.
Oh yeah, yeah. I would say the place where it happens the most is when my work is being evaluated by peers who don't share the journey that I went on to deliver that work. And so that is their greatest service that they can do for me, is their objectivity. They're being divorced from this story, right? And just seeing, is it doing what you say it does? Like this code that you
Right.
wrote. And like, that's what I want. And yet I feel abused often, right? Like I feel like they're not taking into account the holistic nature of the solution that I provided them. It isn't just something designed. If it were just something designed to serve this one thing, then the amount of time that I spent having to like bring it into existence would feel very, very wasted. Like I have learned more and more that like solving software problems means understanding the people behind the scenes, the mission of the organizations that contract for the software to be done in the first place. And yet I can't express that in code. I can only express that in some sort of like muling defense of my work after the fact, or I could just take it in stride. And if I feel any resistance to that stuff, take it into meditation, right? And I've done
Absolutely.
both of those things.
Yeah, so there's so many examples of this. So one example that I've or one catalyst that I've worked on is for whatever reason when I was little, growing up, I think I've made it clear in previous podcasts that I definitely dealt with a lot of orange ray distortion of lack of self love growing up, right?
Yeah.
And I remember one of the interactions that I have with my parents is, whenever I used to talk about something that would be a subjective experience or something that is hard to verify, whether it's about a spiritual experience or whether it's about, hey, we just built this house and the room I'm in, there's something that's causing, there's whether it's off gassing or fungus or something that's causing like congestion in me at night. And it's very difficult to sleep here. So I'm going to sleep in this other room across the house. And my dad, he wouldn't have the same sort of congestion. He tried sleeping there. He's like, oh, it's all psychosomatic. You're making it up in your head. But he'd say it in a very like what I would perceive as a very dismissive tone, almost as if he didn't value me. And that paired with the underlying orange ray distortion of lack of self-worth, it very much colored my perception of those interactions. Right. Looking back, I think he was just stressed out, didn't had too much on his plate already, stuff like that. Right. But that kind of dismissive attitude that my dad occasionally would take with me, I remember would still come up in my 20s or early 30s when someone, in retrospect, a friend would be super stressed out about something and I would say something and they just totally disregard it. Like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. right? In general, you don't say that to your friends unless you're already stressed. But for me, because I had those prior experiences, it would just instantly reconnect with that original distortion, those original memories, and energize them, right? So once again, you could interpret the situation that your friends being dismissive. Well, maybe they're super stressed out, because in general, friends are not dismissive about even stuff they disagree with like that, right?
Yeah.
Unless you have a very abrasive friend, and
Yeah.
we all have those. So yeah, honestly, our own experiences definitely color a lot of these ambiguous situations, and enhance the mirroring effect, and it really just provides us more catalyst for ourselves. Um, if
Yeah.
we're able to approach the situation with that kind of view, maybe not if not in the moment, at least afterwards when you're doing your daily work.
Absolutely. And there was something you were talking about that really struck a nerve with me about like we build these narratives out of this data that we take in. We build like we are trying to take what somebody does or what people do or like conditions that precipitate into our perception, and we're trying to make it make sense. That is a big part of how we work with catalysts in general, I think, is this ability to like create a narrative that makes it make sense to us. The sense that we are making of it is our sense. It's
Right.
our creative narrative, the story we're telling ourselves about what's going on here. And it is difficult to imagine us not doing that and working purposefully in the world as it exists, right? Like we have to kind of like have some idea of what it is that we're all doing here and what I'm doing here and what you're doing here. And this is all something that we invent in order to make sense out of things. But the way that we do that, that is evidence of the polarity that we are, that I guess that is most native to us at that point in our evolution. Do we see it as something that is to be defended against and to be sort of like manipulated and controlled, that so that that narrative tells a story that enlarges our ego and makes us feel better and holds us separate from other and higher up than other people? Or is that narrative something that provides an opportunity for us to see ourselves in the other and to find that help that we can offer them?
Absolutely. So I think let me just finish off this topic of common challenges with another common challenge that frankly it's not just seekers face, but I think everyone faces, is in a group situation, knowing how to there's a dance in a group situation. In most groups where you actually know at least one individual in an orange ray capacity, there's a dance between orange and yellow ray. And even if you don't know anyone in the group, if you've been interacting with that group for more than just a moment, even in that group yellow ray setting, right? Let's say a work meeting, you're starting a new job, having on the first day a group meeting, a conference with other members of your company. That starts off as very much yellow, right? You literally know their names and titles. That's about it.
Yep.
But from that moment, assuming you're going to, spend more than 5 seconds with them, orange ray relationships begin to form, even in the context of that yellow ray setting, right? So one thing that I've noticed is, and I think you often see this, you often see this in social settings where you have a couple, and there's some sort of group conversation going on. And then one person in the couple says something that upsets the other member of the couple, their significant other, in a very orange ray way, right? Where they kind of look at them like, "What? I can't believe you just said that or had that position about this topic," right? And so there's a dynamic, there's an interaction between yellow and orange ray relationships within the group. And the reason I mention this is that it is very, very, it plays a large part in group politics, is understanding yellow and orange ray dynamics. And the reason I mention that is that I've noticed that if you have a one-on-one relationship with an individual, right? Let's say it's your peer in the workplace, right? A peer coworker, so someone who's on the same level, right? Or let's say it's a one-on-one relationship, good relationship with a boss, right? Or your boss's boss.
Right.
that significantly changes some of the yellow ray political expectations when there's a group discussion about you supporting one another. And it's almost like unspoken, but it's there, right? And it's not just in group politics, even in social circles, there's often an interplay with, oh, this person's my orange ray friend, right? So in a yellow ray discussion, there's going to be some sort of expectation. Now, you could say it's cultural, you could say it's individual. I don't know. I haven't mastered this, so I don't know where it comes from. But there's an interaction between orange ray and yellow ray expectations, you know?
Oh, I mean, and it has positive and negative connotations. I mean, what you were talking about could be described as favoritism, right? The
Right.
ability that you have to leverage a personal relationship with the person you report to and turn that to yellow ray role-based advantage. Or
Right.
it could be that your ability as manager, man, I hope I'm predicting the future here. Your ability as manager to connect with someone on a personal level helps you achieve organizational goals better, almost in spite of their ability to understand what they're doing, right? Like they don't
Right.
see what you see. I mean, I often think about the fact that by being in management, you are sort of in all of the meetings that you then have to kind of like represent to your subordinates what happened and what matters to them, to keep
Right.
them focused on work and to make them feel like they matter and they participate, but you're kind of the organ through which that happens. And so your ability to have that one-on-one relationship with them, that orange ray relationship that like, you know, you've got their back. It's certainly something that I'm aspiring to in my new role
Yeah.
because
And,
I definitely think that managers owe their primary duty to the people they serve and the secondary duty to the organization in terms of like, maybe I'll cut that out.
no, I mean, hey, I definitely agree with you. It's not necessarily a very common perspective, at least in
Yeah.
the workplace. But you know, it's funny because this, you see people, you know, mess this up all the time. Like you can talk to someone one-on-one, and you know, you can say, whether it's the workplace orange ray relationship or a friendship, you know, at some point you might not say this is confidential, but it's obvious what you're talking about is confidential. It's obvious to one
Right.
party at least, right?
Yeah.
You know, let me just put it in a very easy context. You have a good one-on-one relationship with your direct report, and you're like, hey man, honestly, I fought against this initiative. I don't believe this, but this is what we got to do to make the higher ups happy. So let's just do it, right? You don't expect that person in the conference to say that, right? But sometimes, you know, even if you have a really good orange ray relationship, if they're not very well versed in orange and yellow ray interactions and what is appropriate and what's not appropriate in the context, they might just blurt that out. And then that affects you in a yellow ray situation. And also, if you had some orange ray relationships with some higher ups, that could affect that. So there's so much interaction between orange and yellow ray, and understanding when something is only orange ray, when something is only yellow ray, and when something is both. And it's honestly not very easy always to untangle those.
I think meditation is a great tool though. And I don't say that like as a offhand kind of thing that you could always say about any situation, but specifically to the extent that you are trying to separate these rays into distinct energies, right? So that it's not as a scientific endeavor that's frivolous. It is a way to sort of understand what energy center you're coming from and to be mindful of that, so that when you encounter blockages that you almost certainly will in the mixture of these different rays, you can sort of in your reflection separate them out, understand where your blockages are, so that you can get up here, so you can get to your heart center. That is the goal here. Like we can talk about playing roles in society, we can talk about being good partners in one-on-one relationships, but at the end of the day, all of those energies and relationships are supposed to be serving our getting to the green ray center.
Absolutely. And Ross specifically mentions, right, from the positive perspective, the best way to balance the yellow ray specifically, Ross says, is to love all those in relationship with it. And really, I think that's also good advice to really strengthen your orange ray as well, right? Those individual relationships. So let's move on to the next topic, which is kind of what are some useful frameworks for kind of viewing these orange and yellow ray interactions that can sometimes help us deal with these aforementioned problems. And so one thing that I've found very useful, and once again, much like many of these frameworks, it's very difficult in the moment to recognize and use these frameworks. These are more the work of putting in the daily practice and using it as kind of like a balancing technique, a processing technique of something catalytic that happened earlier in the day, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think first off is understanding the distortions, the common distortions that many have in orange and yellow ray interactions. And for the first one, there's really 5 categories. I'm just going to broadly state the categories that I found useful and then go into them in more detail. So one category is there are some distortions that I call are from the 2D second density mind, specifically tribal distortions. And Ra actually talks about this. So it's session 19, question 15. So basically, let me just, there's a long question. So the question is about new third density beings who have just made the transition from second density. Is there some sort of a bias in second density for service to self? And so Ra answers, I am Ra, this is incorrect. The second density concept of serving self includes serving of those associated with the tribe or pack. This is not seen in second density as a separation of self and other self. All is seen as self, since in some forms of second density entities, if the tribe or pack becomes weakened, so does the entity within the tribe or pack. Thus, the new or initial third density entity has this innocent, shall we say, bias or distortion towards viewing those in family, the society, as you would call it, perhaps country, as self. Though a distortion not helpful for progress in third density, it is without polarity. So I think basically my understanding is that a lot of the things that we attribute to evilness in society, at least a portion of that tribal mentality, is really a second density mind holdover of that tribal identity. And it's not service to self, it's not service to others inherently, although obviously if you're going off killing all these other people who are outside your tribe, that's definitely more service to self. But the reason I say it's not service to self or service to others is my family, it's a huge family on my dad's side. They're very, very close. And I feel like at least some members of the family that I've spent a lot of time with, I think they frankly approach it from more of a second density bias. They're just, this is my family, it's who I am, and it's kind of not necessarily a service to others or service to self kind of a view on it. Do you have any comments on that particular kind of framework?
Absolutely. So I think this is part of what we were talking about in the last episode, me and Ryan, when we were talking about how second density creatures tend to be very pure. They are purely themselves and purely the pack or the larger group because they don't have that self-reflective nature that asks whether this belonging, this identity is desired by the self at all, right? It's only when we get into this self-consciousness that we start to say, well, do I want what prevails? Do I want to be part of this family? Am I proud to be part of this family? Am I not proud to be part of this company or this nation or all these things? All of these things start to come into play, and you can channel the energies in any way you want with this. I think the interesting thing with yellow ray in reflection of this like identitarian nature of orange ray, right, is that in orange and yellow ray, you are starting to talk about, okay, I can be part of a group, but only play this one role. And I'm self-consciously playing this one role as a unit in this larger thing. The more that you do that, the more that you start to identify with the role rather than with the overall. And I think when we're getting to green ray social memory, we're talking about going the full circle of selfhood, where you've come from this sort of like pack identity through a reflection on yourself as a member of that pack and what that means, and discovering something within yourself that is not part of the pack, but is part of you individually. So when you get to green ray, you pledge that thing that you have, that light within you. You pledge that self-consciously, with self-awareness of what you're doing to the group. And that's different than just being part of a pack that is kind of like a corporate entity of like these different parts. It's all of these parts having their own intelligence that is marshaling all of their power, focusing it all as a planet. That is a completely different thing than a pack. But it takes that concept of self. It takes that awareness of self as a self, awareness of other self as a self, right? It takes that first. Yellow ray is this weird place where we start to like, the pieces start to come together. That's how
Absolutely.
I see it.
No, absolutely. And I wanted to just to clarify one point in that the kind of view of the family, society, or country as self, it starts off without polarity, but I think often it goes into this other category. So, I call this the 2D tribal mind, but often in today's world, some of this is taking place, but often this 2D tribal mentality has made it to what I call the 3D egoic mind. And so that's an orange and yellow ray thing. But basically where you start to say, it's not just that I'm a part of this family, tribe, society, but my family, tribe, society is better than these other ones. I'm inherently better, or with in a very judgmental sense, right? It's a very like negative, and this allows you to justify to kill the other tribe completely, right? Just because they're not your tribe. And
absolutely, you can radiate orange ray identity, but also use the yellow ray as an instrumental step towards that.
Right. And so the other framework I wanted to talk about is kind of the third density ego. And the reason I mentioned the third density ego is I want to say it's very distinct than cultural distortions, because the other frameworks I'm going to talk about are cultural distortions. But regardless of what culture you're in, unless you've been doing the personal work to kind of become more service to others, I think when the energy is kind of stuck in the orange and yellow ray without going to the green, it very much strengthens what, for lack of a better word, for lack of a better definition, kind of a third density ego. And what I mean by this third density ego, and frankly, I'll probably redefine the word ego in a different session. But for now, I'm using it to refer to this idea of it's a personal identity. It's a group identity, right? Personal identity is orange ray. Group identity is yellow ray. But it's where basically you're basically just egotistical about it, right? Like, I'm trying to think. It's difficult because I've been doing a lot of, I guess I'd like to think naturally I've never had much of an ego, so it's harder for me to think of a personal example. But examples I've seen with other people is, you see a little bit of you see it with country identification. It's what we talked about, right? You see it with political party identification for sure, right? In the yellow ray ego, and it's almost like, and the reason I call it an ego is that what I associate with ego is it often feels threatened. It often wants to show that it's in charge and dominant. And anything that questions the ego is often, there's a immediate and very often emotional pushback, right? So if you criticize a group, someone who's very vested in that group from a third density egoic perspective is going to feel attacked and they'll want to respond, right? So that's what I mentioned. And I feel that this is true across all cultures. Like, unless you've been doing the work to be more service to others and move the energy to the heart ray, it's going to be something that's present in these social interactions.
It has to do with the fact that you, as a personality, as a waking consciousness in third density, tend to want to have a concrete self that others are interacting with and that you regard as yours, right? Like, we create this self moment by moment. It is not real. This personality is not real in any material way. The fact that you recognize me as Jeremy, not simply by the way that I look, but by the nuances of how the way that I talk, the way that I carry myself, all of these things build into an identity that I reproduce from moment to moment. Even though if you look at me now versus where I was when I was 5 years old, completely different Jeremy. I mean, there's some things that shine through it. And those are the deeper parts of myself that I can't sort of contrive into existence, right? Through a manner of speaking, through a style and all of this stuff.
Right.
But to the extent that you rely upon that contrived sense of self, it will be vulnerable. It will be able to be attacked. And to the extent that you have learned about yourself to a sufficient level that you can draw upon that deeper part of yourself that's closer to that light you carry within, the less you will be threatened by people attacking those outer constructions of self, right?
Absolutely. And when we're talking about this sort of group ego, especially in the example of, for example, political party affiliation,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't necessarily involve that there's some sort of deep distortion towards lack of self-worth. I mean, certainly that could be an aspect of it, but really it's just that you identify so strongly with this that you don't, in a third density non-green ray perspective, that you don't want it. The ego, the yellow and orange ray, they don't want to be diminished in power, right? That's the basic configuration if it's not informed by the green ray and the upper rays. So whenever there's an attack or something, criticism, the instinctual response, or I don't know if instinctual is the best word, but the non-green ray response to these criticism and attack is a part of you wants to fight back. So the political party affiliation is one common one. Let me give you an example from my personal life where many of us have an orange ray identity based on our career, right? And what I mean by that is if someone's like, Nithin, you're a terrible artist, or you're a terrible carpenter. Well, I mean, maybe I took a carpenting class in middle school, but I don't view my identity as a carpenter. It's not my career. I don't care.
Right.
Really. It's not even a hobby of mine. But let's say it was a hobby. I still probably would not really care, because hobbies, generally speaking, at least for me, they're a very small part of my orange ray identity. But to be frank, I'm a lawyer. If someone said, Nithin, you're a terrible attorney, a part of me would feel would feel attacked, right? I've been doing a lot of personal work, so I'd like to think I won't feel that attacked. But within all of us, there's that egoic third density identity attachment to who we are, and often it's to our career. So it's something that is there. And I think understanding that dynamic is very important when you're interacting with groups, right? Because, for example, some people, especially people who have other orange ray distortions, right? Let's say they're not only identified on their career, but they have a significant orange ray distortion of not being good enough. And can you still hear me? Because I think it's breaking up a little bit.
No, I hear you just fine.
Okay, wonderful. So, let's say someone else at the workplace who is very identified with their role as your boss, but they also, maybe unknowingly to you, have a significant orange ray distortion of unworthiness, right? Let's say you might be in a group, you might be in a yellow ray interaction at a conference, or you might be in a one-on-one orange ray interaction. Let's just say it's a conference, and there's some idea that this boss of yours has, and you're not really, you don't think it's a great idea, and you say what you think is a very political, polite, not even criticism, just pointing out maybe where there's issues with their idea, but because you didn't know that they're so strongly identified maybe with their career, maybe because you didn't know they had much more significant distortion of lack of self-worth, they might take that in a very hostile manner, and it might actually affect how they view you as a worker. And I've literally had this happen, where you really sometimes have to tiptoe very gently around those in power, because you don't know what distortions they have. You don't know how strongly identified they are with a particular role or position, and anything, even in the slightest manner that could be construed as an attack, will be perceived as an attack, and often to your detriment.
Yeah, I agree. And this is where, like, having that orange ray ability to relate to them as individuals can possibly help you have a healthier relationship. Sorry for my beagles howling in the background.
Oh, no worries.
But yeah, I totally agree with you. Like, this is the problem with hierarchy. You just stated it. Power hierarchy means that whoever finds themselves at the top, it doesn't matter how enlightened they are, it doesn't matter how mature they are, it doesn't matter that they have distortions that they have let linger. You're going to be subject to them. The you know what rolls downhill.
Absolutely, very good point.
And look, like there's a quote from a conscious channeling session from 1990, June 15th, where those of Latwii say, in the yellow ray, there is a capacity to take in those configurations of energy which express complex arrangements of interactions. We find these arrangements embodied in institutions and in practices, and more intimately in attitudes that come out of these institutions and practices. So that is with respect to the attitudes that the more immediate work is accomplished when I'm working in yellow ray. All of these things have penumbras and auras that issue from them. It's bigger than just people occupying positions of power within the hierarchy. There's entire thought forms that come out of this. And I think that there is a session that the working group intensive circle did at the first intensive dealing with yellow ray concerns in organizations, where they talked about like the reason why these yellow ray relationships matter in the spiritual sense is because there's these finer energies that are being woven together, finer than what we can accomplish in that one individual to individual orange ray. That is a very intense, but also very direct way of relating. When you get into yellow ray, now it's about possibly thousands of people all sort of having these finely woven relationships and responsibilities to each other that are hard to articulate. And the more complicated and sophisticated the organization is, the less you're going to be able to just put your finger on the way that you relate to all these things and say, that's what's going on, right? There's this deeper, finer thing going on that we can't even really understand. And yet we all feel its power. We all feel the pull that organization has. We all know that whether you're organizing a workplace, you're organizing a business, you're organizing like a family gathering, any of these things, like this ability to relate to people where you can see them as all part of a machine. To say a machine would be too mechanistic, but like maybe all part of an organism, right? And the organism has different organs in it. And all of these things are necessary for the whole to come into view. But how do you know that your part of the organization is going to be preserved? You don't necessarily. You are in other words, yellow ray seems to be an enlightened version, in potentially, of being a means to an end, of
Right,
not being
exactly.
an end in yourself, but being a means. But what's the positive way to realize being a means? And I think service is one way to talk about it. Service. Inside of service is encompass all of the different ways that we relate to one another and that we affect one another.
Absolutely. And it honestly can be very difficult. Even if we build these communities, obviously, the Other Selves Working Group and the meetings we have, it's a wonderful, beautiful meeting of people. We've been doing it virtually, but it's great. But sometimes it feels the application of these energies and understanding these energies is very different when you're working with people who are still having not made the choice, or on the verge of making the choice, or still kind of just on the path, right? And
they bring in these confused attitudes. I think that Latwii session really got into it well. Could I quote one more part from it?
Oh, please.
So Latwii says, the attitudes involve a give and take of energies and an acceptance of patterns in behavior and a feeling which comes upon one as from a source which is larger than one and which seems to be other than one. To deal effectively with the balancing of the yellow ray, one must accept that the illusion in which one deals is as it should be, and one must accept the gift that the illusion offers in the form of the particular experience which is one's own. I think that puts it so much better. I was striving for an explanation that was like that, but it's like you have to accept the yellow ray matrix of power as kind of a given and then work from there.
Absolutely.
The reason that you accept it as a given is you recognize the sophistication of the relationships with which you're dealing. It is not something where I can just sit down with Nithin, have a one-on-one, and we can work through our BS, right? No.
Right.
You're talking about potentially tens, hundreds of thousands, even millions of people when you start getting into the finer ways in which a nation state relates to each other, right?
Absolutely. And I think this quote is very on point because, if you've listened to our previous podcast, and I think also the presentation about balancing techniques, there's many ways into acceptance, and the kind of
Yes.
one way that that I'm using right now for this discussion is understanding. Not that you can understand everything, frankly, but if you can, at least for me, I guess I'm very more mind oriented. Um, is if you can understand something, for me, it's then very easy for me to accept it. So that's kind of why we're going through some of these frameworks, and to continue on to the other three frameworks. And these final three frameworks is understanding distortions through the lens of culture. So there's really three frameworks here. In that one I term as culturally recognized distortions that are encouraged. The other area is culturally recognized distortions that are discouraged, and the other area is culturally is distortions that are not culturally recognized. Let me start with that category: distortions that are not culturally recognized. So, for example, when I have a one-on-one discussion, or sometimes a yellow ray group discussion of people who are open to maybe more spiritual things, but maybe this is the first time they've really talked about it. And when I say open to spiritual things, I very much ground it in practical advice of how people's lives can be better. So one thing that often comes up is, because I, work in the field of law, a lot of stress related to the job. I often talk to other people about how to cut down on their stress, right? And I say, hey, the idea that we're often raised with and society teaches us that we have to work hard, and if we're not working hard, we're not good citizens. The whole framework of you have to work hard, you have to do these things, you have to must. These are all things that are almost like triggering our fight or flight response from the red ray. And yes, look, I've been there, I've done it. There's a deadline, I have to get this done. The adrenaline's pumping, I get it done. It works, absolutely, it works. But the question is, isn't there a better way to go about this? And I, I've been trying to tell people that you can move. I often characterize what I just described as a very control, fear-based way of motivating yourself to work. And you can move from a control and fear-based motivation to a love-based motivation, like just finding out. But once again, I'm big on organic flow. So in any given time you want to implement in the moment, you might not succeed. It's more about doing the daily work, being like, okay, I was really stressed out about this, and the only reason I finished is because I felt I had to. I gave myself a forced deadline. So how can I, in that daily moment, in that meditation later on that day, thinking about how can I approach it differently? When are times where I've done great work without feeling like I have a deadline, without feeling the rush of adrenaline? And at least for me, it's when I start early and I tell myself, you don't even have to work on this more than 10, 15 minutes. Just get it going. And you know what? Even if there's a deadline coming up in 3 or 4 days, if for whatever reason you need to ask for an extension, you're going to ask for it. You're going to give yourself that out, that if something comes up and you need to ask for more time, and people are like, oh, how can you do that? It's like, well, I trust myself. I've used this methodology enough to know that 95% of the time I don't ask for an extension. I actually get work done much more efficiently and productively because I'm not under stress. I'm not stressed out. I need less downtime because I'm not filled with adrenaline at the end of the workday. But when I talk about this idea that we, in this society, we're motivated by fear and control and adrenaline and fight or flight to get our work done, at least in professional careers like the lawyers, they just look at me like I'm crazy. Like they don't even understand the distortion that motivates their hard work. It's like it's just totally foreign to them. So this would be an example of something that I would say it's a distortion of motivating yourself through fear that it doesn't even trigger. It's not even on the radar. They don't even see it. Right. Do you have any comments or kind of other maybe distortions that would fit into this category?
Yeah, I think there is a pattern that we use lower chakras as like ways to whip ourselves into shape, because those energies, as unpleasant as they can often be, do get results. In fact, those are the very energies, emotions, feelings, attitudes that served us well in second density, that got us from being rocks to being, trees and animals. And they're our patrimony. They are there to be drawn upon. I just think it's important that we recognize that truly moving the ball forward on the evolutionary path involves creativity now. It is not simply the limbic system responding to
Absolutely.
like stimuli. That is a second density way of relating to things. And we will always have that within us, just like we have that first density consciousness within us, and there are tools that we use for that too. But as we move forward through the densities, I believe that we learn to have different aspects of selfhood that are mysterious in potentiation, and that through catalysis come into activation. We learn to trust and rely upon them, and then we don't have to. It's more an issue of nobody makes themselves slave away at a job because they like it. They do it because they don't have an alternative.
Right.
Being open to the potential of the moment makes you more and more aware of the creative potential of that moment. And what I saw you talking about, as what I heard you saying, was that you came up with a way of using the energy of the present moment to focus yourself and get away from other tools, other energetic ways of expressing yourself that might be more deleterious, right?
Absolutely. And, so I give an example. And the reason I gave this example is, in not my current job, my last job, I had, 10, 12 direct reports. And these were often new attorneys, and I'd be mentoring them as how to do great work without being necessarily completely stressed out, which is a very common way, I guess, new attorneys handle stuff. And when I would describe it in the broad overview of what I just did, basically like blank stares. So then, I learned, I learned and I recognized this. This was an area where even just talking about the distortion, it didn't even register as it wasn't recognized as a distortion, like moving yourself through this sort of work. So then I kind of reworded what I was saying, and I put it into a category of distortions that our culture recognize and encourage. And I'd say, hey, I know that you have to get this done, but have you thought about like being consistent about, exercising every day after work? You might feel like you need to stay late, but there's always tomorrow. And, consistency is key when it comes to exercise. And they're like, yeah. Because that's something that's understood and recognized culturally. Now, it doesn't necessarily fully encompass what I was trying to describe, but it at least does a little bit, right? They're not super hyper focused on like, fight or flight. I'm going to die if I don't get this done on this particular time, when, it's just more, it's a more relaxing way of engaging with it, but it's
gives you a toehold. Yeah, it's giving you a toehold into a different way of being a self, right?
Exactly.
And you're exposing them to this, hey, you are more than what you think you are right at this moment.
Exactly.
It's beautiful.
And to use that same example in the third way is to also say in that conversation, hey, look, man, you're starting to burn out. And the reason I can tell is, like the other day you were snapping at people and you recognize that this was happening. These are all signs of burning out, just the way you carry yourself. And, you have to know the person one-on-one, have that orange relationship to know when you can call them out usually. And when you have, you actually are recognizing the correct signs of burnout, as opposed to something's going on in their personal life at home that's making them upset. Right. And they're like, burnout is, to most extent, at least in some workplaces, a culturally recognized and discouraged distortion. And they're like, yeah, I'm burning out. I gotta cut back. Right. It still is not the full kind of overview of what I talked about earlier about how fundamentally our society, the way we motivate our work is fear and control and fight or fight based, but it gets us closer to the ballpark. Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So those are just kind of, just some examples of maybe understanding, as Lotwe talks about, where these distortions in the orange ray and yellow ray are currently at, and helping you maybe figure out a little bit more of, and interpreting a little bit more of these ambiguous social and one-on-one interactions can help us, basically better utilize our own catalysts in these interactions, but also help us maybe serve others in helping them utilize their catalyst. And ultimately, the reason this is all for, Jeremy, why are we talking so much today about orange and yellow ray distortions? Like, what's the whole point of this?
You've been begging me to do this episode for a long time, and I finally gave. No, I'm just kidding. I think it's because these are the lower chakras. These are the lower energy centers. They are, if they're distorted, they're in the way of that energy flowing to the heart. And the green ray, the open heart, is the goal.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better.
Good, because I thought maybe you meant something else, and I was
no, absolutely.
Nice.
I mean, the
Yeah,
whole point
like
of this, yeah, is so that you can more and more bring that energy up to the heart, and it's a when you're on the path and you start to experience it, it's a beautiful experience. It feels like the energy is flowing, and if you've never really experienced it, it's hard to describe, but it just feels right, you know.
and another thing I would say is that those moments when you are able to open the heart, it imbues the lower chakras below it with more meaning and character of possibility, right? Like things that seem so complicated and insurmountable in yellow ray start to seem like doable. Things that seem so fraught and you'll never get beyond these problems in an orange ray individual relationship start to dissolve, and you start to see that these are just things, these are just energies to be worked with. And there's what I'm trying to say is that it's in the green ray that you start to really come into your own with the creative potential of these 7 colors that we paint our picture of the creator with, that we try to show each other who we are, not just who we are individually, but who they are as a result of all of us being in this relationship of service.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we did a real good job here. We covered all the topics that I was thinking about would be useful to have a examination of, at least if you're trying to better understand these orange and yellow ray distortions. Ra talks about specifically that I think sometimes when people get fed up with the whole yellow ray thing, they revert to orange rays.
Right.
Maybe if at least one person is less likely to do that because of this podcast, we succeeded, right?
If you're a survivalist, pay heed, my friend. It is not about the individual surviving of apocalypse. That is not the road that we as a species on this planet are traversing. We are in it together. We don't need to protect the self nearly as much as we often think that we should. Sometimes there's a place for it, right? And the one thing that we can't do, Nithin, the one thing that we can't do for the listener is give them the hard and fast rules. What
Right.
we're encouraging is a creativity and the ability to think laterally about life so that you are not trapped by its logic and you're not imprisoned by its constraints. The constraints become freeing. They become ways to be creative and to let love and light seep through the cracks in all of these seemingly static and solid things so that you can start to see this as a celebration of the creator in this density and then the next density and the density after that. All of it is a creator. All of it is self.
Couldn't have said it better myself, brother.
All right. Well, you want to leave it here?
Yeah.
Awesome. My wife is doing a craft show right now, and I think she needs a bathroom break. So I'm gonna race over there and see if I can get her something to eat and give her a chance to have a break. And I'll mix this down later.
Awesome,
But I
dude.
hope. Thanks so much for doing the video thing. We are trying to do this more, and I think there are people who really like being able to see us. Why? I have no idea. But
No, I
but
get it. I think
I don't
there's more of an
question.
energy. I think there's more of an energy transfer. The more closer you get to like in person. So like voice is better than text, but voice with video is better than just voice. Absolutely.
It bears saying, Nithin, because I know that you and I have interacted over like bring forth and those kinds of like textual tools. And when we started talking face to face online, it kind of, and I saw this with other seekers in the working group. It's not as good as hanging out and having a beer together, but it's that much closer, right?
Absolutely.
So I want the listener to think of themselves as part of this group of friends, all trying to creatively find this way of expressing the creator and kicking butt at the same time, right?
Hell yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us on yet another episode of Inaudible. Reach out to us if you have any suggestions for topics. I know that we've already had one suggestion on talking about the sinkhole of indifference, and we're planning a episode on that. But please let us know what you want. We want to serve. And in the meantime, friends, stay in the love and light.